Do we stay conscious after being beheaded? In 1905, a French doctor set out to find the answer. During an execution by guillotine, he called out the condemned man's name. What happened next was so disturbing it sparked a debate among scientists that still lingers today. But this is just one of many moments in history that seem too bizarre to be true. A man who was poisoned, shot, beaten, and drowned, yet refused to die. A woman who survived 3 of history's worst shipwrecks. A disease so terrifying that even the Nazis ran from it, except it never existed. History is full of stories stranger than fiction, and by the end of this video, you'll have heard some of the most unbelievable ones. In 1943, inside the Nazi-occupied Rome, a deadly disease called Syndrome K was spreading in Fate Benefratelli Hospital. It was highly contagious, disfiguring, and fatal. The Nazis, terrified of infection, stayed far away. But here's the secret. Syndrome K wasn't real. It was an elaborate deception created by Italian doctors to save Jewish refugees who had fled to their hospital. When Nazi soldiers arrived for inspections, the doctors exaggerated symptoms, fake coughing, labored breathing, convincing them that entering the quarantine area meant certain death. The ruse worked. Those infected were in fact Jews hiding from deportation. Thanks to the bravery and quick thinking of these doctors, at least 20 lives were saved. The hospital remained a place of refuge until the war ended. Today, Syndrome K stands as one of the most remarkable acts of medical resistance, where deception, rather than medicine, became a life-saving cure. Few people can claim to have survived one shipwreck. Violet Jessop survived 3. In 1911, she was a stewardess on the RMS Olympic when it collided with another vessel. The ship was damaged but managed to return to port. A year later, she boarded the Titanic, this time as a nurse. When the ship struck the iceberg, she was ordered into a lifeboat, where she cared for a baby given to her by a desperate passenger. Astonishingly, she later worked on the HMHS Britannic, a hospital ship during World War I. When it struck a mine and began sinking, Violet jumped overboard, narrowly avoiding being sucked into the propellers. She continued working at sea for decades, earning the nickname Miss Unsinkable. Despite witnessing some of history's most infamous maritime disasters, she never feared the ocean. When asked how she survived them all, she simply replied, "I just did my duty." Genghis Khan is remembered as a ruthless conqueror, but his greatest political move was hidden in plain sight: his daughters. Instead of marrying them off for alliances, he turned them into rulers. Each time he allied with a kingdom, he had his daughter marry the king. Then, he sent his new son-in-law to war, where most of them conveniently died in battle. With no male heir left, his daughter took full control of the kingdom. This wasn't a one-time strategy. Several of his daughters ruled entire regions of Central Asia, expanding the Mongol Empire without ever lifting a sword. Some were feared warriors themselves, commanding armies and holding power long after Genghis Khan's death. While history often overlooks them, his daughters weren't just political pawns. They were leaders, conquerors, and survivors in an empire built on warfare. In 1910, the United States faced a meat shortage. A radical idea emerged, importing hippopotamuses into Louisiana's swamps. Yes, hippos. The plan was to let them roam the bayous, eating invasive plants and providing a new source of meat. Supporters described hippo meat as America's next great delicacy. But the story gets even crazier. 2 of the men lobbying for the bill were rival spies, one a former Confederate soldier, the other a French mercenary. They had been sent to assassinate each other years before, but instead became political allies on this bizarre mission. The plan gained traction, even reaching Congress, but was ultimately rejected. If history had taken a different turn, Louisiana could have been full of wild, free-roaming hippos today. Instead, hippo meat never reached American plates, and the idea faded into history, a strange but true chapter of failed agricultural innovation. For centuries, visitors to Hagia Sophia, the magnificent Byzantine cathedral in Istanbul, noticed strange scratches on its marble walls. No one knew what they were, until historians finally cracked the mystery. They weren't just random marks. They were Viking runes carved over 1,000 years ago by a Norse warrior, likely a member of the Varangian Guard, an elite force of Viking mercenaries who served the Byzantine emperors. The inscription is believed to say something as simple as, "Halfdan was here." A Norse warrior far from home left a mark in one of the most important buildings of the era. The scratches remained untouched for centuries, overlooked until modern experts identified them as authentic Viking carvings. Today they are one of the rare traces of Norse presence in the Byzantine world, hidden in plain sight. In Nazi Germany, being Jewish meant certain death, especially for those in the public eye. One actor, Lionel Royce, found an unbelievable way to survive. When the Nazis blacklisted him for being Jewish, he fled to the Alps, where he grew a thick beard and dyed his hair using hydrogen peroxide. Then, he reinvented himself as Caspar Brandhofer, a self-taught peasant actor claiming he had no formal training but an innate talent for performance. His transformation was so convincing that he returned to the German theater scene. The Nazis praised him, calling him a shining example of Aryan superiority. They had no idea they were celebrating the very man they had once tried to erase. He continued performing throughout the war, his true identity hidden in plain sight, a man who used deception not just to survive but to outwit one of the most ruthless regimes in history. During World War II, captured Allied pilots feared brutal interrogations. But when they met Hans Scharf, they were caught off guard. There were no beatings, no threats, just long walks in the woods, casual conversations, even shared meals. Scharf's tactic was simple: act as if he already knew everything. Pilots let details slip without realizing it. One prisoner, convinced Scharf had inside knowledge, accidentally confirmed a secret bombing plan. Another, feeling at ease, talked about fuel shortages in Allied planes. The information added up. After the war, Scharf's methods were so effective that he wasn't punished, he was hired. The US military studied his techniques, and today, elements of his approach are still used in intelligence gathering. Scharf, once an enemy, later worked for the US Air Force and even advised police agencies on how to get people to talk, without them ever realizing it. In 1957, a Soviet nuclear plant deep in the Ural Mountains suffered a catastrophic explosion. A radioactive waste tank at the Mayak facility detonated, sending a toxic cloud into the air. Villages miles away were suddenly evacuated. Families were told nothing. People left behind suffered burns just from walking outside. The ground, the water, everything was contaminated. 270,000 people were exposed. The disaster was so severe that Soviet maps erased the entire area. For years, no one outside the USSR even knew it had happened. The CIA discovered it in 1960, but chose to stay silent, fearing it could damage America's own nuclear energy reputation. It wasn't until 1976 that a Soviet scientist who had witnessed the disaster firsthand defected and revealed the truth. Even today, parts of the region remain heavily irradiated, decades after the event was covered up. On September 12, 1897, 21 Sikh soldiers of the British Indian Army stood against an onslaught of 10,000 Afghan warriors at an outpost in Sarigari, India. They knew there was no escape. The enemy surrounded them on all sides, outnumbering them almost 500 to 1, but instead of surrendering, they fought. Rifle in hand, bullet after bullet, they held the line. For 7 hours, the Sikh warriors repelled wave after wave of attacks. They ran out of ammunition, then fought with their swords and bare hands. When the last soldier fell, he was still defending the signal post. By the time reinforcements arrived, Sarigari was lost, but 600 enemy fighters lay dead. The British Empire later awarded each of the 21 defenders the Indian Order of Merit, the highest military honor of its time. The battle is now taught in Indian military history, remembered as an act of unparalleled courage and sacrifice. Speaking of courage, in April 1951, 600 British soldiers of the Gloucestershire Regiment were trapped near the Imjin River in Korea. Surrounding them, 30,000 Chinese troops. Knowing they were outnumbered, the British radioed the American command for reinforcements. But when asked about their situation, they replied, "A bit sticky." To American ears, this sounded manageable, like things were tough, but under control. In reality, the British were on the verge of annihilation. No reinforcements were sent. For 3 days, the outgunned and exhausted soldiers fought back wave after wave of attacks, using rifles, bayonets, even their fists. They inflicted over 10,000 enemy casualties. By the time the Chinese broke through, only 39 men escaped. The rest were either killed or captured. The battle, a direct result of a simple language misunderstanding, became one of Britain's most legendary last stands. In 1972, archaeologists excavating the ancient city of Hassanlu in Iran made a haunting discovery. 2 human skeletons locked in an embrace, their faces pressed together as if in a final kiss. Dating back to around 800 BCE, the Hassanlu lovers were found among the ruins of a city that had been burned to the ground. Some believe they were lovers caught in the devastation, choosing to die together. Others suggest they were simply two victims who happened to fall that way. What is certain is that their pose remained undisturbed for nearly 2,800 years, a frozen moment of human connection in the midst of destruction. Today, they are one of archaeology's most poignant and mysterious finds. In 1945, as World War II was nearing its end, Peru suddenly declared war on Germany and Japan. But this wasn't about fighting, it was about diplomacy. By that time the Axis powers were already collapsing. Peru had remained neutral for most of the war, but when the United Nations began forming, only countries that had declared war on the Axis were allowed to join as founding members. With that in mind, Peru, along with several other Latin American nations, rushed to declare war just months before it was over. There were no battles, no military actions, just an official statement. The move worked. When the UN was officially created later that year, Peru was included as a founding member, securing its seat in global diplomacy without ever firing a single shot. In 1959 in segregated South Carolina, a 9-year-old boy walked into a public library and asked to borrow a book. The librarian refused. "We don't lend books to black people," she said. The boy refused to leave. Police were called. His mother, furious but composed, convinced the officers to let him check out the book. That boy was Ron McNair, and he didn't just read about science, he mastered it. Years later, McNair earned a PhD in physics from MIT and became one of NASA's top astronauts. In 1986, he was aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger when it tragically exploded after launch. The library that once denied him books? Today it is called the Dr. Ronald E. McNair Life History Center, named in honor of the child who once fought for his right to learn. During the American Civil War, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw led the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first all-black units in the Union Army. In 1863, Shaw and his men charged Fort Wagner in South Carolina. They fought fiercely, but the regiment suffered heavy losses, and Shaw was killed in battle. The Confederate Army saw him as a traitor for leading black soldiers. To dishonor him, they buried him in a mass grave with his men, rather than giving him a proper burial. Union officers offered to recover his body, but Shaw's father refused. "We would not have his body removed from where it lies surrounded by his brave and devoted soldiers," he wrote. Today, Shaw's name stands alongside his men's on the Boston Common Memorial, a permanent tribute to their bravery and sacrifice. When William Whipple signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, he pledged his life to the idea that all men are created equal. But there was a contradiction. Whipple owned a slave. Unlike many of his fellow signers, he didn't ignore this hypocrisy. Shortly after signing, he made a decision that shocked those around him. He freed his slave, believing he could not fight for liberty while denying it to another. His former slave, Prince Whipple, went on to serve in the American Revolution, fighting for the very freedom his owner had just granted him. While many of the founding fathers continued to own slaves long after the war, Whipple stood by his principles, making him one of the few who truly acted on the words they signed. Keeping track of soldiers in an ancient army was no easy task, but the Persian Empire of the 6th century BCE had a brilliant solution. Before a campaign, every soldier placed an arrow in a large basket. The arrows were counted, and the basket was sealed until the army returned. When the soldiers came back, each one took an arrow. Once the last soldier retrieved his, the remaining arrows revealed how many men had been lost in battle. There were no complex records, no written lists, just a simple, foolproof system using the very weapon they carried. This method was remarkably efficient for an empire that spanned thousands of miles. It allowed commanders to assess their losses quickly, without relying on messengers or inaccurate reports. While empires have long since moved to ledgers and databases, the Persians' arrow-counting technique remains one of the most practical early military tracking systems ever devised. In the 1880s, the director of the Harvard Observatory, Edward Pickering, was frustrated. His male assistants were slow, made mistakes, and lacked discipline. In exasperation, he reportedly declared, "My Scottish maid could do better." So he put his words to the test by hiring her. Williamina Fleming, a former maid with no formal scientific training, stepped into the observatory and quickly proved she was far more than just a domestic worker. Pickering tasked her with analyzing photographic plates of the night sky, a tedious job most men considered beneath them. But Fleming didn't just do the job, she revolutionized it. Over the next 3 decades, she led a team of female astronomers, now known as the Harvard Computers. She personally classified over 10,000 stars, helped develop the system still used today, and discovered white dwarfs, dying stars on the edge of extinction. She even identified the famous Horsehead Nebula, one of the most recognizable structures in space. From scrubbing floors to charting the heavens, Williamina Fleming's journey shattered expectations, proving that brilliance isn't about where you come from, it's about what you do when given a chance. In 2003, an Afghan farmer named Abdul Wali walked into a US military base to clear his name. Someone had falsely accused him of being a terrorist. He believed explaining himself would be enough. He was wrong. The CIA took custody of Wali and handed him over to a contractor named David Passaro, who subjected him to days of brutal beatings. Wali was kicked, struck with a flashlight, and left to suffer in a sweltering, airless room. By the 3rd day, he begged for death. Hours later, he collapsed and never got back up. Passaro became the first CIA contractor convicted for detainee abuse after 9/11. But for Abdul Wali, justice came too late. His crime? Trying to prove his innocence? During the American Revolution, an enslaved man called Billy was charged with treason and sentenced to death by hanging. His crime? Fighting against the American rebels. But in a brilliant act of self-defense, he used the very system that enslaved him to save his life. Standing before the court, he argued, "I am not a citizen, I am property. How can I commit treason against a country that does not recognize me as a person?" The logic was undeniable. The court had no choice but to pardon him. He walked free, not because of justice, but because the law that enslaved him could not also condemn him. His name is lost to history, but his story remains one of the most unexpected legal victories of the Revolutionary War. In 1942, the British government developed a terrifying biological weapon, a plan to drop anthrax-laced linseed cakes over Nazi Germany. The goal? German cattle would eat the cakes, become infected, and pass anthrax to the civilian population. The attack would have killed millions and crippled the country's food supply. To test its effectiveness, British scientists released anthrax spores on Grunard Island off the coast of Scotland. The island became so contaminated that it remained uninhabitable for 48 years. The plan was never carried out, but the anthrax tests were deadly enough. When British scientists returned decades later, they found spores still present in the soil. It took a full-scale decontamination effort in 1990 before the island was finally declared safe again. A war that never happened, but one that left a lasting scar on the land. During World War II, the Polish army had an unusual recruit, a bear named Wojtek. It all started in 1942 when Polish soldiers found a small orphaned bear cub in Iran. They raised him like a comrade, feeding him condensed milk, teaching him to wrestle, and even giving him beer. But Wojtek wasn't just a mascot, he was officially enlisted in the army as Corporal Wojtek, complete with a service number. During the Battle of Monte Cassino, he helped carry heavy artillery shells to the front line. Soldiers swore he understood commands, standing on his hind legs to transport crates of ammunition. After the war, Wojtek was sent to Edinburgh Zoo, where his old comrades visited him for years, climbing into his enclosure to wrestle and share drinks, just as they had on the battlefield. A statue of Wojtek now stands in Scotland, honoring the bear who fought alongside men in one of the war's fiercest battles. Before he became the first black Supreme Court justice, Thurgood Marshall was just another student who got into trouble. One day, after misbehaving in school, the principal handed him an unusual punishment: sit in the basement and read the entire United States Constitution. At first, it was just a way to pass time, but as he read, something clicked. He memorized sections of it and started questioning the laws around him. That forced reading session shaped his future. He later became a lawyer, dedicating his career to challenging racial segregation. His most famous case? Brown v. Board of Education, which led to the desegregation of American schools. Decades after that day in the school basement, he sat on the highest court in the country, using the very document he once read as punishment to reshape American history. Grigory Rasputin was no ordinary man. He was a mystic, a healer, and a controversial figure in the Russian royal court. But what made him legendary wasn't his life, it was his death. On the night of December 29, 1916, a group of conspirators decided to kill him. First, they laced his food and wine with cyanide, enough to kill 5 men. Rasputin ate and drank it all, and nothing happened. Panicked, they shot him in the chest. When they checked his body later, he suddenly leaped up and attacked them. Terrified, they shot him again 3 more times. Still, he clung to life. Finally, they beat him, tied him up, and threw him into the freezing Neva River. When his body was pulled from the water, an autopsy suggested he had drowned, meaning he may have still been alive when he hit the ice. A man poisoned, shot, beaten, and drowned, and yet he refused to die easily. In 1905, French doctor Gabriel Bourieu wanted to answer a disturbing question. Could a person remain conscious after being decapitated? He got his answer in the most unsettling way. On June 28, Henri Languille, a condemned prisoner, was executed by guillotine. As soon as the blade fell, Bourieu rushed forward. What he saw shocked him. Languille's eyes opened. When the doctor called his name, the severed head focused on him, blinking, looking, reacting. This continued for several seconds. Bourieu repeated the experiment, calling Languille's name again. More blinks, more focus. Finally, after about 30 seconds, the light in the prisoner's eyes faded, and all movement stopped. His findings fueled long-standing debates on whether people remained aware for brief moments after beheading. Though the guillotine was considered swift and humane, this experiment suggested otherwise. Some stories in history are so strange that they seem impossible. But does that mean they really happened the way we think? Many of these events are backed by solid historical evidence, like the doctors who tricked the Nazis, or the Polish bear that became a soldier. Others, like Rasputin's murder, have been told so many times that fact and fiction blur together. Did he really survive poison and bullets? Or did the story grow bigger with each retelling? And then, there are the real mysteries. Did a man truly blink after being beheaded? The doctor who recorded it swore it was true, but modern experts disagree. Could Kishtim's radioactive wasteland still be hiding its full impact? The Soviet Union erased it from their maps, but the contamination remains. So tell me, which of these stories do you think actually happened? And which ones might just be a great tale that stood the test of time? Share with me your thoughts in the video, and if you like my work, hit the subscribe button so you will never miss the future updates. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and I will see you in the next one.